Regulatory frameworks set the stage for business, economies, and society to operate. They define roles and limits for the public and the private sectors, and balance the safeguarding of citizens with the facilitation of business and entrepreneurship. Future frameworks should catalyze innovation and sustainable solutions, and allow for speed and adaptability to cope with technological change. How can governments design and deploy regulatory frameworks conducive to innovation? How can the regulatory agenda catalyze sustainable innovation and enable inclusiveness, resilient solutions, and partnerships? With the Frame the Future Conversation Series, we are engaging corporations, nonprofits, government agencies, universities, entrepreneurs, and you. We are bringing forward 5 future-defining topics: innovation, partnership, sustainability, resilience, and inclusiveness. With each topic, we are bringing forward new ideas, sharing insights, and driving change. Join global leaders and us on September 8th to frame the future of regulation.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Roberto Alvarez. I am the Executive Director of the GFCC. It's great to have you here for another GFCC Frame the Future conversation. We are talking today regulation, and this is part of a series that the GFCC has started in June 2021, and that it's leading up to our Global Innovation Summit on December the 1st and the 2nd, 2021. So, briefly, if you didn't have a chance to be part of our Frame the Future sessions before, or if you don't know the GFCC, I invite all of you to check our website and to join the conversation. The GFCC, it's a global multi-stakeholder organization. We have a footprint today in 30 countries, and it's great to have you here as part of this conversation. Really, as you have just seen in this short introductory video that we had through the Frame the Future series, we are exploring how 5 future-defining topics can be weaved into competitiveness strategies: innovation, sustainability, resilience, inclusiveness, and partnership. And we are seeing that, we're exploring that, looking at a variety of competitiveness strategy decision areas. Today, we're talking about regulation, regulatory environments. We all know that technology moves fast, and moves faster than institutions, and policy moves faster than regulation. How could we close that gap as we have new technologies going to the market, and we have new industries emerging, and industries being reshaped by technology advancement? How can we, in some way, connect future growth with the emergence of new technology-enabled models and improvements in the regulatory environment? The whole notion here is how we can accelerate innovation, how we can deploy sustainable solutions in face of those issues. Please be part of this conversation. So this conversation is being broadcasted on YouTube, and here on Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature to share at any point your questions. I will be looking at those. I'll be inserting questions into the conversation, the questions that you will be sharing with us here today. Also, as happens in many of our sessions here, please feel free to share resources, information, reports, and even best practices and cases in which you are involved. Feel free to do that. Ensure that everybody here will profit from the conversation. So let me briefly introduce our speakers today as we are getting ready for the session. We have an amazing group of people joining us from across the globe today, from several time zones. And I will briefly introduce our speakers here today, starting with Margareta Drzieniek, who's joining us from Switzerland. Margareta was the mastermind and the main author of the Global Competitiveness Report, the Global Skills Risk Report, and others created by the World Economic Forum. She now leads her consultancy practice, has been consulting with governments around the globe, especially in the Arab world, but in other parts of the globe. Margareta is a GFCC fellow. It's great to have you here, Margareta. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we have Juan Pedro Corica. Juan Pedro is the co-founder and CEO of QMax Renewable Energies. Juan Pedro, in addition to that, had a stint in government. He was a leader of the federal government of Argentina and the city government of Buenos Aires, driving innovation and entrepreneurship. He's an investor, has been investing in several ventures, and has been coaching entrepreneurs across Latin America and the world. Great to have you here, Juan Pedro. From London, we have Laura Sandys. Laura, we're very happy and honored to have Laura as a GFCC Distinguished Fellow. She's a Senior Independent Director at SGN Network. She has an amazing track record in energy policy and food. She also works with the Energy Systems Catapult. She's a board member there, ECLA Energy Efficiency. She's a former member of the parliament in the United Kingdom, and she leads the Food Foundation. She's a founder and has been working, as I said, the intersection of policy, technology, food, and other areas. Great to have you here, Laura. From Kuala Lumpur, we have Tengku Azrul. Tengku is the head of innovation systems at Futurize, which is a subsidiary of Cyberview under the Ministry of Finance in Malaysia. And he has been working in public policy and connecting technology entrepreneurs and policy in Malaysia, and has worked in developing an outlook for the future economy in Malaysia. And especially, he's a key leader driving in delivering the national regulatory Sandbox initiative in Malaysia. So wonderful to have you. Thank you for being here. I know it's night there in KL. And from Washington, D.C., we have our colleague and friend, Chad Evans. Chad is the Executive Vice President of the Council on Competitiveness in Washington, D.C. In that capacity, Chad has been leading a variety of innovation initiatives in the United States and across the globe. He was a key leader developing the national innovation strategy back in the early 2000s. And now Chad is the main person behind the National Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontiers in the United States. He has led that. And in addition to the several capacities and initiatives that he leads in the council, we're delighted to have Chad as the treasurer of the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. So really to thank you all for being here, and really to get started, maybe I want to start with you, Chad. You are a key innovation player in the United States, and you've been looking at different issues around the globe, working with different countries. So I want to turn to you for your initial remarks on how do you see this nexus between innovation, competitiveness, and regulation? So over to you, Chad.
Hi, Roberto. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with old friends and new friends. So, and I look forward to the conversation. And, I thought maybe, Roberto, what I would do, I spend most of my day thinking about innovation and how do we scale and deploy innovation around the United States, but also in some strategic key partners. And of course, regulation is critical. And although it's not what I spend most of my days thinking about, I did sort of step back in preparing for this conversation. And I thought if it's helpful, I would provide maybe 3 or 4 or 5 case studies where interesting regulatory practices in the United States unleashed unexpected innovation. And I thought perhaps that could be a catalyst for some conversation. And each of these cases are slightly different from each other. but there might be some key threads we can all pull on as we discuss this further. So I'll start with, I'll give you 5, and they cover everything from price controls and competition to food safety. I'll touch even on a little bit on antitrust, but also on maybe the really exciting topic of government procurement. That always gets everyone going in the morning. But first, price controls and competition. Let's go back actually quite a bit in history. In 1978, the US Congress passed a law that allowed airlines, for the first time ever, to set their own fares and routes. This move ignited a tremendous wave of competition and innovation that has transformed the industry, but also the passenger experience. As a result of this act, the cost of airline fares declined dramatically. New companies formed very quickly. Airlines created and innovated the hub and spoke system that is now the global best practice. So you can see one little change can have massive repercussions across not only an industry, but around the world. A second example, let's look at genetically modified foods. In the 1980s, the United States took a very different approach to regulating genetically modified food and agriculture compared to, say, Europe, which had a perhaps, I guess, from a US perspective or US lens, a slightly stricter, more precautionary approach. The US adopted, in basic terms, a 3-principle regulatory framework. The first principle was really focus on the end GM product rather than on the process of the genetic modification that was used. Second, in the absence of verifiable scientific risk, there is no reason to bar the product. That's sort of the second principle. And the third principle that was adopted was that we needed to understand that genetically modified products are part of the evolution of agricultural innovation. And risk, in fact, have been in line with those of traditionally produced foods. So in the context of those 3 principles, GM products in the United States are reviewed under existing federal regulations. And while this approach has been somewhat controversial and created actually quite a bit of trade friction with Europe, it has helped the US industry grow and has helped maintain some dominance in the agricultural biotechnology space. Since the introduction in 1995, land devoted to GM crops has increased by more than a factor of 100. The United States today is the top biotech crop ag cultivator worldwide. I think a little over 70 million hectares. You look across the EU, there's less than 1/4 million hectares. So a very different space as a result of regulatory action. A third very different area of regulation I'll just point out as an interesting case study from the US perspective is something we call the National Cooperative Research Act. When you go back to the founding of the US Council in the mid-1980s, the United States was facing incredibly strong competitive pressure from Japan Incorporated and from the West German export engine. At the same time that we were facing that intense competition really based on total quality, we did see the emergence of new technologies, but that were deemed a little too risky or too costly for individual companies to invest in their development in the United States. However, fears of antitrust laws kept private companies from cooperating in pre-competitive R&D that might have helped to lower some of the barriers to scaling and developing those technologies. So the National Cooperative Research Act of 1984 reduced this antitrust barrier. How did it do that? One, it assessed ventures under a rule of reason rather than immediately deeming them illegal. 2, if a venture was found to actually be an antitrust violation, awards were limited to actual damages, not the triple damages that are the norm in standard US antitrust penalty. And finally, the loser in the case would have to pay the litigation costs. So as a result of this change, US companies really began to form hundreds of consortia to share the costs and the risks of research and development. And today, these sorts of R&D consortia are an extremely important part of the US innovation model. And in fact, the law has been later extended to cover joint production ventures, but those have not taken hold as fast as the pre-competitive R&D consortia. So a tremendous change and really a driver of US innovation and productivity over the past 30 to 40 years. A fourth model, a fourth best practice I'll just quickly share, is really around the regulation of the internet. You know, at the dawn of the internet, the Clinton administration took a really visionary approach to regulation. It issued an important policy framework document in 1993 called the National Information Infrastructure Agenda for Action. And this agenda for action outlined how the information infrastructure could unleash an information revolution that would forever change the way people live, work, interact. But let's think for a moment, 93. I don't know about the rest of you. I didn't have my first email account until 96 or 97. So this was very forward looking. I mean, this is like in the early days of the browser. So it was quite visionary. And just as important, the document explained that information infrastructure has to include more than just the physical components of the internet. It had to also include the vast universe of information that would eventually flow over this infrastructure to the population. And would also have to include the applications, the software, and the devices that would actually allow people to access and use that information productively. So this agenda for action really proposed a series of regulatory actions that would, in essence, rapidly scale the internet's adoption and use in the United States. That included things like opening competition, ensuring universal access, developing new interoperability standards, reforming existing regulations that would impede the development of interactive services and applications, streamlining the application and use of our spectrum, and then finally ensuring the adequacy of copyright laws. Okay, and now a fifth and final sort of best practice, just to put some ideas on the table, something very obscure, but very important in the US innovation regulation case, is something called Other Transactions Authority, OTA. What is that? Well, the US government procurement process and regulations are notorious for their complexity and their burden. In particular, discouraging many potential innovators and small businesses from engaging in federally funded research and technology development to meet government needs. Now, to reduce those regulatory hurdles, 11 government agencies were given what is called Other Transactions Authority that allows the government, under certain conditions, to enter into agreements that are exempt from these burdensome procurement regulations. So these agreements can be used for things like R&D projects, prototyping, follow-on production. They can be structured as joint ventures or as consortia. All that's required is a 1/3 cost share. Now, when we look across the US government, the Department of Defense has been the largest user of these Other Transactions Authorities, and they've used them to do things like pooling R&D resources with industry to develop or obtain state-of-the-art dual-use technologies that cannot be produced in the government, that have to be secure from the private sector. They're using these authorities to attract non-traditional contractors to work with the Defense Department. They're using these authorities to lower the cost and eliminating requirements that are associated with traditional government procurement. And finally, they're using the authorities to speed up the acquisition process. And through those actions, the US Department of Defense has really made good use of the OTA, the Transactions Authorities. If you look back just in 2015, Other Transactions Authorities accounted for just 3% of the Department of Defense's total R&D portfolio. But by 2019, and I'm sure it's even higher today, Other Transactions Authorities account for nearly 20% of the Department of Defense's R&D portfolio, increasing from $700 million US to nearly $8 billion. That's nearly a tenfold increase in a very short amount of time. And we can see as up to more than 30 consortia have been formed around these agreements, mostly associated with DoD. Now, despite these best practices and some of these success stories over the past half century, what we see today is the US government struggling and regulating new technological disruptors, the point, Roberto, you raised at the beginning of this conversation. So I wanted to point to 2 or 3 technologies and emergent space where we're facing some challenges. Let's look at drones. Our Federal Aviation Administration is struggling, and it has been doing so for more than a decade really, to develop regulations for the use of drones. The development of small drones is not being driven by the traditional aviation industry, but largely by disruptors, innovators in the electronics or IT space. And these disruptors are much more entrepreneurial, they're more comfortable with risk, they value speed to market, and they have traditionally been subject to minimal regulation. Whereas traditional aviation is a bit more conservative, concerned, of course, with safety, tightly regulated, and relatively risk averse. Now, our own national academies in the United States has concluded in a significant study that the Federal Aviation Administration risk culture is too often overly conservative with regard to drone technology, preventing safety beneficial drone operations from entering the airspace. So there's some changes coming, but it's been over a decade. So to your point, the regulations are way behind the technology. Another case where this is true, driverless vehicles. The pace of driverless vehicle technology is putting tremendous pressure on motor safety vehicle regulators. You know, these automated vehicles, they may not have steering wheels, pedals, or mirrors. Roberto, I actually remember the first time I was in a driverless vehicle was with you in Arizona, in Phoenix. And although there was a safety driver with us, it is a dramatically different experience. And we have to come to grips with that. These automated vehicles may have different passenger seating configurations. They definitely rely on networks for their operations. And they have to react to unpredictable road conditions with pedestrians, bikers, and others. So these unconventional motor vehicle characteristics may require new approaches to safety regulations. And in fact, the US Department of Transportation has stated that the pace of innovation in automated vehicle technology is completely incompatible with our current slate of lengthy rulemaking proceedings and with highly prescriptive, feature-specific or design-specific safety standards. And so new standards will have to be more flexible and responsive. They'll need to be more technology neutral, and they're going to have to be more performance-oriented to accommodate rapid innovation. So I could go on some other technologies, but let's just look to the future for a moment. You know, we are month 9 of a new Biden administration, and there is a strong push to address climate change. And he has articulated a set of very high goals. Cut by the year 2030, economy-wide net greenhouse gas pollution by 50% from 2005 levels. Create a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035, and a net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050. They are calling for the implementation of new fuel economy standards that would lead to a fleet average of 52.4 miles per gallon by 2026. I mean, that's just around the corner. And another very high goal is the mandate that 50% of all new vehicles manufactured by 2030 must be powered by battery electric, plug-in hybrid, or fuel cell vehicle powertrains. Now, achieving any one of these goals is likely to involve a range of carrots and sticks, much less all of these goals. Now, how are we dealing with that in the United States? Some states have already begun to move in this direction aggressively by adopting what we call renewable portfolio standards or goals. These set a minimum requirement for the share of electricity supply that comes from a renewable energy by a certain date or a certain year. As of September last year, 38 states and the District of Columbia, where I'm based, had established a renewable portfolio standard or a renewable goal. And in 12 of those states, plus the District of Columbia, the requirement is for 100% clean electricity by 2050 or earlier. So roughly half of all growth in the United States renewable electricity generation and capacity since the year 2000 has been associated with these state renewable portfolio standards and requirements, not national regulation. So in conclusion, US businesses, we hear it all the time, they're often complaining about government red tape, the smothering effects of regulation. And in fact, in the United States, which, and I'm sure this is true in the other countries we're going to hear from, the development of new regulations is always controversial, it's always contentious. We have multiple stakeholders with loud voices in the process. But at the end of the day, at least from the US perspective, if industry does not identify and address the negative impacts of its products, its services, how they are made and how they are delivered, it is very likely the government will do it for them. One final thought, Roberto, as we talked about this with our fellow panelists right before we came on air, the COVID-19 situation, we look at things like Operation Warp Speed in the United States, which was a tremendous reduction of barriers to the production and deployment of vaccines. I would put on the table for a conversation with my fellow panelists, why can we not replicate and scale that model for other industries and other technologies? We know we can do this, we have proven it. We've all talked about how each of our economies are now over 50, 60, 70% vaccinated in less than a year. So I'll leave that on the table for now, Roberto.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you so much for this amazing panorama on things that happened in the past and that laid the ground for a lot of what we see in terms of innovation and the economy in the US today, but also highlighting some of the very specific challenges that you are seeing today. And when we think about the future, and I want to turn to you, Margareta, I remember a lot of us here being together in different moments and you talking about future readiness, right? So how do you see those issues that we just talked and the nexus between technology growth and creating the institutional and regulatory foundations that would allow for that future? So over to you, Margareta.
Yeah, thanks Roberto, and welcome everyone, and thanks for having me. So when we look at the future and we think about future readiness, first of all, what do we mean by future readiness? And I think that's an important question. So what we understand by future readiness is that we want to anticipate trends and we want to ensure that we leverage the opportunities and at the same time are resilient to risk the future can bring, right? So these are the two things that we were looking at. I think when we think about those two, the risks and the opportunities side, one element quickly comes to mind is many of those risks and opportunities are actually highly systemic in nature. And systemic in the sense that, those are not single issues, but those are issues that are very interconnected with a host of other issues. And just coming back to the example that Chad has, the regulatory example that Chad has mentioned earlier about autonomous cars, one of the main issues about regulating autonomous vehicles is who pays the insurance, because there's no driver anymore and who's responsible. So this is one of those examples of systemic issues. It's not just the automotive industry alone, it's also electronics industry, right? So this is cross industry, but it also goes out, and it's not just technology, it also goes out into the broader fabric of society as well. And when you think about issues such as the increasing demand for recycling, for the circular economy, the increasing growth of the circular economy as well, it also goes behind the product use. It's not just until we use the product, but also the product use. And these are also issues that we have to think about, because the circular economy trend is approaching very, very rapidly. Maybe one example on this also is, and what is the solution to this? I think, regulation is not just in the realm of government. It hasn't been for a long time, but I think not all the governments have adopted this in the same sense. Many governments still think that regulation is in their realm, and that they take those decisions. But it needs to be much more collaborative. It needs to be cut across the different stakeholders as well. Be an enabling factor for public-private collaboration, as Chad has mentioned earlier as well, but also look at the broader stakeholder system, because when we, for example, think about the food system and think about the need to improve nutrition, reduce obesity, which is one of the societal goals. So then what follows from this is that the regulation is to cut across, even whatever we take in terms of regulation. Think about just labeling of food, right? We need to take it not only into the medical sphere, into the prevention of medical prevention, the healthcare system. We need to take it into the education system. We need to take it into the food producers. We need to take it down to the farm where it's tracked, etc. So things become just significantly more complex, and this is likely to increase and increasingly more systemic. So this is one thing. The second element, and it also links to what Chad was saying. I think there's a huge element that's related to how public procurement systems are structured and how they enable innovation. And my thought is slightly different to what you guys. I completely agree with what you said, but I think there's another aspect which is different. When you think about innovation, how it's rolled out, then actually innovation is rolled out in the market and it's tested in the market. It needs a market to really show its effects on the economy, on people, and all the good things that it can produce. And much of the market in the US, but in the European countries even more, is dominated by the public sector, by the government sector. In some countries, it's 60% of the market that's then dominated by the public sector. It's huge. And this public sector is largely the way it takes the procurement decisions. It's likely about risk aversion, right? It's the public sector procurement decisions are very often built and budgeting decisions are very often built to avoid risk. And I'm talking about the decisions around, for example, healthcare provision, around business model innovation. If there's a new business model that does not fit into the procurement system, then very often this market remains closed to this company that has developed this new business model. Think about it. At the beginning, Airbnb, hotel, just purchasing from hotels versus purchasing from Airbnb. Very simple, right? Huge markets that are closed and that prevent companies from rolling out this innovation into markets. Because budgets and public processes are built to minimize risk instead of fostering innovation, creating those markets for innovative companies. Maybe one last aspect that I want to mention is this third one. This is this idea, and this links back also to this: how can regulatory systems be used to spur innovation? And again, because innovation is done in the market, the moment for those countries that are very innovative and that specialize in specific sectors, they can really spur innovation, and especially in a fast-moving environment, become the standard. Take the example of Denmark and wind energy, that is what it has done, right? There were so many different standards developed along the way and so many different regulatory procedures that were developed. And this industry also for this reason, because there was so much public-private collaboration across those regulations, this industry became a very, very strong and one of the global players from a tiny country, right? Tiny country. And also because there was a clear push from the government in order to promote this industry, of course. So it was and promote innovation in this industry as well and invest in this, but also the regulatory side was a very, very clear aspect of this as well. So it can be, there's something like regulation diplomacy, I guess, and there is something like, you can build competitiveness through regulation, especially in a very fast-moving technology context. And when you think about standards, for example, as well, there's a whole area of standard diplomacy that's very political that we don't need to get into, but we know all about this. That it is very important for building competitiveness, and if it's your standards that are widely adopted, then your country's industry is in a much stronger position as well. I'll stop here, and there's of course a host of things that we can discuss later on.
Thank you so much, Margareta. And I think that you brought some fundamental topics, and the one that really sticks to my mind is complexity. Yeah, and where you mentioned about how different technologies are moving, how things are the systemic nature of changes, and probably something that we could talk later is how to deal with that complexity from competitiveness policy, competitiveness strategy standpoint. So thank you so much for bringing that to the table. And having said that, Laura, I want to turn to you. You've been involved with regulation from different angles and different aspects, including being a member of the parliament, right? But you are really at the top of something that's fundamental today. And Chad has mentioned that, and others, energy transition and new models that are being enabled by technology growth into the energy space, like the digitalization of energy, something that you are very much into today. So what's your take on this nexus connecting competitiveness, technology change, the things that we're doing, and regulation? Over to you, Laura. Great to have you.
Thank you so much, Roberto. And it's absolutely great to be part of this very prestigious team here, this panel today. And thanks to Chad and and Margareta, because they've really framed in many ways some of the opportunities around regulation. I don't want to be a negative person on regulation, but I might sort of focus a little bit on some of the challenges, and that might be a sort of UK, maybe European dimension too, which might have some different, because regulation is embedded with culture, actually, and the culture of risk, the culture of opportunity. And so one has to look at it through very much a human prism as well. Anyway, I'm very, very excited and worried about climate change. I'm excited about what this means in terms of an industrial revolution, one that is in many ways highly desirable in terms of what Margareta was talking about, the circular economy, doing more with less, productivity gains, but also very much with the understanding that we are actually facing an existential risk to our futures, and this is not to be messed around with. So, and regulation plays a very important part. But I would say that regulation at this moment faces three drivers of change. And certainly in the UK, I sort of question a little bit how much they're really up for it, or have the skills and culture, coming back to culture in a sort of way. So I've been issuing quite a few reports about all regulators need to be net zero compliant. Chad talks about what's been going on in the US. The UK has been quite far ahead of all of this and has been driving very, very serious legislation. The problem is the legislation is there, fantastic, and everyone slaps themselves on the back. The regulators are not embedding the legislation, despite the fact that there are very clear targets, into everything they do. And let's look at regulation right across the board, and you start to see and understand the fossil fuel bias, unconscious bias, as we talk about in other areas, where actually there are pivots towards fossil fuels because that has been the response in the past. So we're calling very much for a regulator's audit of all their processes. They need to do a lot of housekeeping, a lot of cleaning up, and a lot of pivoting away from fossil fuels. And it's not their fault, but they need to get on with the job. So that is the first thing. The second driver I see, and this is where I chair the government's digitalization of energy task force, is how digitalization and innovation, very much picking up on Margareta's point, is actually breaking down the silos of these industry-focused regulations, blurring the boundaries, and starting to actually create, and I don't, sort of envy them, real problems for regulators. Because certainly when we start to look at digitalization, we start to look at all this great innovation stuff, everything is underpinned by communications. So does our energy regulator talk to our comms communications regulator? I was the one who introduced the two chairs to each other. So I can tell you, they are not talking to each other about the integration, the conflation of infrastructures and the conflation of business models. Now that then becomes a problem for innovators because their innovations aren't siloed by sweet little 19th century ideas of what industry looked like. They are absolutely vibrantly and pulling together all these different dimensions. So there is a real need for regulation to start to understand actually the consumer experience, the technical experience and the innovation experience, and start to break down those barriers. The third area is new consumers. And it's so exciting to see how consumers are driving change, and they're looking for change. They're looking for new ways of doing things. I did a crazy speech to 150 masters, young people a couple of weeks ago, and I asked how many, at the end of it, how many of you would like to own a car? And it was about 6% who put their hands up. At my ancient years, if we'd done the same thing when I was 23, it would have been 95%. So we're looking for change. We're looking for driving a different set of outcomes. But we also have to have our regulators understanding they mustn't stand in the way of those new experiences. But they have to be absolutely clear about what consumer risk exists, because the risk is going to be more complex, it is going to be more interrelated, and it will need a lot more unpicking. And for example, when it comes to climate change, we've got to be really, really clear. Anything that is missold once, I mean, you talk about driverless cars, the first crash becomes the absolute point of totemic risk assessment. And then you get all my former colleagues, those politicians who are by definition ambulance chasers, running after this and saying, we've got to stop that. We have something in the UK called the Dangerous Dogs Act, which was because some child got bit once, right? Not quite, but almost. So we have to understand where risk lies. So I throw out to regulation that it needs to start to rethink its shape, very much its culture, and very much its approach. It has to look at, I mean, we have certainly in the UK, we have very old regulations. So ours are not as contemporary or as exciting as others, which needs a bit of an overhaul. But we need to start to understand that we are not in the process regulation business. So Ofgem in the UK is lovely, but they tell you what colour socks to wear on a Thursday, okay? And a different colour tie on a Friday, may I be clear, right? We've got to have regulators that understand risk regulation, not process regulation. They need to, in many ways, shape around what I would call perimeter regulation. So they allow a lot of innovation within an edge of risk, within a circle of risk. And that starts to unlock lots of different opportunities. I don't know whether it's happening in other parts of the world, but certainly in the UK, we are also incredibly focused on fairness and equality. And regulators are now being asked to manage and to value those aspects in a very different way. And I leave you with this one point, and it's about net zero, and that is citizens, voters, consumers have a veto on net zero if we do not do it fairly. And they will veto it. And the French have seen that with the Gilets jaunes. And we've got a real priority to ensure that we don't exacerbate inequality. And that's a former Conservative MP talking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura, for, I would say, advocating this fundamental change in the approaches toward regulation. And Juan Pedro, I want to turn to you because I think there are different layers that we could add to this conversation. One is that you are a clean tech entrepreneur. So it's on your interest to advance clean tech and move toward net zero. But also you come from an emerging country, right? That has a different reality in relation to the global north. So how do you see those things playing out? Being an entrepreneur, having worked in the government?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Roberto, Chad, and the whole team of the GFCC for inviting me to this great panel. Great topics have been placed on the table. I just wanted to share first one thing that really calls my attention recently, and I think it is very important, and it's about the process of creating regulation. We all saw in the news the big drop in the valuation of the big tech companies 2 months ago. There was a leak that the Chinese government was about to put in place new regulation for the digital technology industry. But why did a mere rumor erase 17% of the valuation of these companies in just 3 days? Why that happened? And it seems that investors didn't trust in the process of creating regulation in China. In the same industry, however, we also last year, all the CEOs of the big tech US companies in a public hearing for an investigation for dominance in the market, but the valuation of these companies didn't have the same impact. Why did that happen? Again, it seems that investors trust the justice system and the democratic institutions in the US. So I think transparency in the process of creating new regulation is for fundamental importance for investors. As we all know, investment is what we need for innovation and for the big change we need to do in our system going to the energy transition, to the net zero new era. All right? So I think that is one big element that I wanted to share with you. Going to the question of you, Roberto, here in Latin America, what we are doing, I would like to share with you an example in the trying to foster renewable energy in the region. Latin America were among the first countries running capacity auctions to incentive investors to create new renewable energy generation in the region, all right? This was led by Brazil in 2005, but then the rest of the countries in the region were doing something similar. In Argentina, for example, in 2015, only 2% of the renewable energy matrix were from renewable sources. So what the government did to try to overcome this problem? In 2015, we passed a new law for the promotion of renewable energy, and in 2017, the government created a new program that was called Renovar program, created a financial de-risking mechanism supported by multilateral institutions to give confidence to the investors to invest in big generation of renewable energy. That changes in 4 years, multiplied by 4 the capacity generation of Argentina. So this is an example of how a good regulation can have a great impact in our region. Now, almost every country has a law for distributed energy that was a given in the developed countries, in the US, in Europe. They had it like 15 years ago, but this is something new here. So I think this kind of regulation can advance innovation and sustainability in our region.
Juan Pedro, thanks for highlighting this and even mentioning Brazil. Yeah, I think you and I have been talking about things in the region, right? And the challenge related to let's say, innovation in the region. And one thing that we could explore later is your take on some of the aspects that we heard about innovation, the public-private interface. So I just want to leave that thought to you. But having said that, Tengu Azrul, you've been driving the national Sandbox initiative. You've been working on that in some way is really prototyping new regulatory models, right? That's what I understand, in connection with the development of new technologies and new business models, and addressing many of the topics that we heard here today. So how does it work in practice, and what's your take on the things that we heard?
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. To relate back on the National Regulatory Sandbox, I would like to go back to what Chad mentioned earlier. the two most disruptive technologies that everyone trying to adopt and still figuring out how can we adopt that in a proper regulatory framework. Number one, which is drone and autonomous vehicle. Back in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, the Prime Minister came back from a very good business trip in China. The first question that he got to us is, why is it so easy for those countries to fly a drone, but it's quite impossible for Malaysia to fly a drone? In 2017, it's nearly impossible, or it is illegal to fly any drone in Malaysia without a proper regulation, because as what Chad mentioned, the classification of drone in Malaysia, initially, it was classified as a toys. It's not a proper tools for business. So when we sit down together with the community regulators and the industry, we look at how can we resolve this. I think what Laura mentioned earlier is very true, where the regulator, they don't like to really go down to the level of industry where they start talking and they communicating. But when we look at that, the growth potential of drone industry in Malaysia or in this region is quite high, because in this region, we still have our one of the most important economic sector, which is agriculture. And the labor cost is really high. So with certain sort of automation, the deployment of IR4, the usage of drone AI is pertinent for the development of that sector. So in 2018, when we get the regulator to start coming down to look at how can they facilitate the development of this industry. So we created a testing zone to show to the regulator that when you properly regulated a certain technology, you can see that it can be deployed under a very proper risk assessment, where you look at how can you start deploying a drone with a proper regulation, proper registration, because as what everyone mentioned earlier, most of regulators, especially in Malaysia or Commonwealth region, we are very risk averse. It's always about what if something bad happened. It's not about what if it is really good for the country. What if something really bad happened? Same goes with the autonomous vehicle. We've seen Singapore, our neighbor down south, started testing autonomous vehicles since 2017. But when we tried to get that technology tested in Malaysia, our Road Transport Act, which is 1987, I think during that time I'm still in it's not even, I didn't go into kindergarten yet. So the regulation is there to say that the vehicle need to be a licensed driver. When you put autonomous in this picture, who are you going to license? So either the system or safety officer. But when you yourself be in an autonomous vehicle, you see how safe it is, what's the risk factor has been taken, what type of insurance that is able to facilitate that. So at least the regulator is okay to adopt that, and under National Regulatory Sandbox, where Futurize has been mandated by the government, we've been working very close with Ministry of Transport. They really come down to look at the industry, whether how can they support, what can we do together. So rather than deploying an autonomous vehicle testing zone for the whole Malaysia, we took a very small step, but it's a really important step. We demarcated a certain area in Malaysia to be enable the innovators to test the technology, to show to the government that the technology is really safe if you deploy it properly. So I think now we're going to be having about 3 locations for autonomous vehicle testing, but for drone, I think the growth is exponential. Our FAA equivalent, the CAM, Civil Aviation Authority of Malaysia, in 2020, they come up with the new MCA, the regulation, Malaysia Civil Aviation Regulation, to look at how can they support the deployment of drone, especially in agriculture, especially in the special project, where when we talk about drone, the first problem is flying the drone itself. But now when the technology start advancing, we're talking about beyond visual line of sight, where the drone has been flown autonomously. So how can we, together with the industry regulator, to look at what can we do to make sure that the technology has been deployed in a very safe environment. So it's all started with the sandbox approach, where we start really small to show to the regulator on how can it be done properly. So I think that is the importance of National Regulatory Sandbox, where we really promote the innovation-driven and adaptive policy making, rather than very it's only me, it's my way or highway. Now the regulators start to listen to the industry, to listen to the community. I give you an example. When our first testing of autonomous vehicle in Cyberjaya, the regulator is okay, the industry is okay. Suddenly there is a question from the community: how safe is the vehicle? What if something happened? What if the vehicle go off the road and start to hit somebody? Lucky for us, until now we have zero accident. We've been tested for a few hundred hours already, even during the COVID. So I think this is the approach of NRS is really good to frame how regulators should take it, especially on the new technology when the law and regulations say cannot. So in Malaysia, we use a guideline or ministerial directive to say that if something that is not in the regulation, it should be touched in the guideline. We follow how UK did. I've been to UK, I've been to Milton Keynes in 2015, I think. So the first guideline that UK Ministry of Transport did, I think it's only about 20 pages to enable the testing by Catapult UK. I've met our good friend Catapult UK there, testing the port and whatnot. It's a really simple document to enable them to test the autonomous vehicle in a very safe environment. But now, if you look at the regulation, especially in the UK, it's really thick. The regulation, it go by a certain area in the UK, whether it's in Liverpool, whether it's in Milton Keynes. They have a different approach on risk assessment. If you're going into a very busy road, it cannot be all the time. It may be from 11 a.m. to 12 a.m. where the road is not busy. So we get that approach. We introduced that in Malaysia to say that this is how we mitigate the risk, while waiting for everyone to be very comfortable with the regulation and with the technology. And to state a fact that the current batch of regulator, they're not really afraid to embrace the changes. So in Malaysia, we are working together on how can we get those new sort of technology to be deployed, because again, that's the drive of where we are now. We are at the 6th wave of innovation cycle, where like what everyone mentioned is about clean tech, is about AI and robotics. How can those economic sector been helped by a certain regulation where I agree, regulation is needed. Regulation should be there to ensure the safety of public, but regulation shouldn't be the blocking the road bump and roadblocks to stop the innovation to be deployed, especially in a developed country like Malaysia. I think, thanks, Roberto.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Azrul. So am I correct to understand that in Malaysia, you have a legal mandate to lift existing regulations for the test projects that you are running for those new technologies?
Okay, that is a little bit on the thin line. Yes, the regulation is still there. But if it's something that is not doable under regulation, we did another guideline. We call it a ministerial directive or a guideline, a soft law, to basically oversee the deployment of a certain innovation. So if anything happened, at least there is a guideline to look at that, and there is a proper act at the very top to govern everything.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And this is a case that really caught our attention, and we have Dr. Yusuf Sulaiman here. When we actually kicked off this whole conversation series, we clearly remember that Yusuf mentioned the National Innovation Sandbox as a best practice. So thank you so much for being here. Chad, I want to turn to you. Maybe it would be great if you could help us to continue the conversation. I think you have like 30 minutes for to engage with speakers. I know that you have a few questions. So Chad, over to you.
Well, thanks, Roberto, and wow, incredible panel. Thank you all for your thoughts. And I have a couple of threads I wanted to pull on, and I'll go back to maybe the beginning because each of you addressed this in some way, but maybe we can go deeper. And this is really about how do we regulate at the pace of technological advancement. And as each of you have indicated in your own way, you know, technology advancement is accelerating. And for some technologies where we think regulations are likely to be needed, gene editing, driverless vehicles, we haven't even talked about apex technologies like AI. Governments are struggling to sort of keep the pace. So I'd like to ask each of you, in addition to what we just heard, the case study around sort of emergent tech test beds, and as you scan your own nations or even around the world and other experiences, what can governments really do to reform or streamline the regulatory process to accelerate rulemaking for these emerging technologies? And as you think of that also, you know, regulating these technologies, that comes with cost and with benefits. And it can actually accelerate or impede innovation and the adoption of other technologies. So also think about, as you draw the line and draw the balance, I guess, between cost and benefits, speed and caution, who do we need to hear from in our societies? Also, and what disciplines need to be contributing expertise to these conversations and to these regulatory processes? You know, Margarita, you mentioned at the very beginning of your first set of remarks that this is a systemic issue and that we need to be much broader in the way we think about the regulatory development process, the conversations around the regulations. So I'll start there. What can governments do to reform and streamline their regulatory processes? Who do we need to hear from more? And what disciplines need to contribute to the conversation around regulating emerging technologies? And I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand, or I can call on someone. Juan Pedro, please.
Yes, let me share an example that I think that goes to your point, Chai. 5 years ago, there was a gathering between the government and the fintech and the crypto, let's say, a group or association in Argentina, and they were talking about this, no, how to deal with this new kind of company, of type of way of doing business. What was it? Crypto, etc. So I think at that time the government took a good approach, and they say, well, this is so new to do something. So let's keep collaborating. Let's keep the connection. Let's keep discussing to understand what is happening, but let's don't do anything too soon to stop this industry from growing. All right? So going fast forward now, we have a very big crypto community giving services with a lot of developers, one of the leading spaces in the world for a country that is struggling with a lot of problems in the economy. But this sector really grew, and now is leading in the world. And we also have recently a new unicorn that is called Walla, that is a fintech. And for all Latin American countries, financial inclusion was a big problem, because in the developed country, you have like, I don't know, maybe 80–90% of the people in the financial system. But in Latin America, we were lower than 50%. So there was half of the population out of the financial system. So this was a combination of a big problem to tackle with a different approach, not just innovation, but inclusion. And also the government taking some time not to block this this group to grow, and then try to be connected and to understand what to do.
Thanks, Juan Pedro. Please, Margareta. But that you sort of hit on that sort of that balancing issue, and when do you sort of let things emerge, and then of course you have to have a new conversation as you reach unicorn status. But please, Margareta.
Yeah, I think there's one important issue which is from my point of view a big change, and Laura alluded to it as well. There is a different expectation from regulation in terms of what it has to achieve, right? As well from consumers, and it is not. And this is a step change. And talking about back to your question, Chad, about who needs to be part of the conversation. When you think about regulation of, this issue is well known, right? When people started using AI for selection selection of employees, they perpetuated past patterns and had a huge gender bias. So, this is a real issue for regulation today, right? When you think about how does the product or the service affect different groups in population, is something that we economically, in terms of inclusion, in terms of access, is something that we did not think so much a few years ago, 10, 20 years ago. And this is going to be more rather than less. And we don't know at all how to deal with this at this point in time, right? This is entirely new.
That's good. Yeah, thank you, Margareta. I don't know if Laura or Tinko, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know if you wanted to jump in here or have any reactions to Juan Pedro or Margareta.
I sort of wanted to pick up on sort of good examples of what I think everyone has talked about, which is what's called risk regulation. And I was involved in the Food Standards Agency in the UK, and it was regulating the cafe on the corner the same way as the multinational supermarket, right? Because that's how the regulation's built up. Mm-hmm. So fine, right? Ludicrous. So they've actually gone through a huge reform program where they do a risk assessment. And the risk assessment says, if you are selling coffee and buns, you are not very risky, right? But even if you're a little cafe and you're selling steak tartare, you suddenly become a lot more risky, right? And if you've got lots of shops selling steak tartare, you're probably less risky than if you've only got one. And it does a full triage of your risk profile. And then, as a result, takes you through the regulatory process to ensure that you're actually starting to be properly calibrated. So risk is crucial and outcomes are crucial. The process of getting there shouldn't be the regulator's responsibility. I think too many regulators actually sit into those businesses rather than standing apart from them and expecting outcomes to be performed. And the outcomes might be very different, but as long as they're not posing consumer risk, societal risk, that's absolutely fine. Just picking up on one example to answer your question, Chad, the energy sector, for example, is going from 400 people who all know each other's golf handicap, right? That is how intimate this little world is, real mates, to 100 million actions and assets on this system, right? So every EV car can do two things. Now, if you as a regulator think that you are going to be able to regulate every EV car driver as you have those 400 nice golf playing colleagues of yours, you will fall over. The regulator will collapse. So unless they understand that they need to drive a different shape for regulation, picking up on all the innovations that we need, they will actually come a cropper. And then they will find the stakeholder that they really end up having to talk to is the Secretary of State or Parliament, where they end up getting beaten up. So there is an incentive for them to change. Very quickly on your AI point, I do think it's really, really important that we don't just look at each algorithm. It's going to be now with these blurred infrastructures, it's going to be the conflation of algorithms, and it's going to be the point of joining where you might end up with all sorts of strange things. And our report that we're doing at the moment will propose that there is a data and algorithm oversight in its own body that can actually understand cross-regulation, bad, unfair outcomes.
Thanks, Laura. Tinku, I don't know if you had any reactions, but I have a couple of other questions I wanted to sort of tease out from what I've heard from the panel so far.
Yeah. No, I think the cost of regulating this, I think it's when you want to deploy a certain innovation, it's a chicken and egg situation, whether you regulate first and you start deploying, or how. So the very important thing here in getting this issue, getting this regulated, I think we need to get the regulator to understand the industry, but everyone is talking about that. Regulator need to understand the industry. But now we need to flip it a bit to say that the industry need to understand the regulator as well. Why is there in the first place? Why do we need to regulate you? Because you see, everyone is crying foul where, oh, regulator doesn't allow me to do this, regulator doesn't allow me to do that. But the regulation is there for a reason. And it is man-made anyway. Regulation is man-made, so it can be changed, but there must be a reason to change, and everyone should be talking to each other. The quadruple helix model worked really good here, and like what Laura mentioned earlier, communication shouldn't be a stumbling block. It should be the facilitating factor to get everyone talking to each other and get things done.
Thank you, Tinku. I want to pull actually a question from Q&A because it actually connects to a question that I had in my mind, but I'm going to ask everyone to think very broad and systemically. But I'll start with a question in Q&A. It comes from Mike Nelson from Carnegie here in the United States. When it comes to digital technologies, national governments struggle to make effective, consistent policy because different agencies have very different goals. So privacy commissioners think encryption is great. Cybersecurity thinks encryption is great. Law enforcement hates it because criminals use it to hide their crime. So his question is, what do you do in that national context? My question was going to actually be, different countries have different cultures, values, ethical standards. So not only is it an issue within individual countries, but as you begin to think about the global playing field, how do we resolve these sorts of differences to ensure level playing fields, fair and robust global competition, equitable contributions and benefits, and bilateral, multilateral cooperation? So I don't know if anyone wants to tackle the national question, the global question, or if you want to try to weave it together. Anyone have any initial reactions? And thank you, Mike.
Could I come in here about culture, yeah. Mainly because Chad talked about GMO, and this is a big debate in the UK and in Europe, and it will probably be a big debate when it comes to a UK-US trade deal. So it does permeate everything, and that cultural piece, I think, has to be very seriously understood. Coming back to the question about this whole thing, actually, some of those different interests, privacy versus law enforcement, are actually quite important tensions. They're not bad per se. And actually, by working together rather than in conflict with each other, you might end up with some interesting solutions. But it takes somebody to make the decision at the end of the day. And so it is a sort of bit of a hierarchy. And we were involved in, we have designated in the UK our energy data, our energy system data, presumed open, right? Now, all I can say to you is the secret squirrel people in our country all were hyperventilating on the back of that, right? There was a lot of tension. But fundamentally, what we realized was actually visibility is greater resilience. And opaqueness actually is vulnerability. But one had to go through that argument. So tension is good, but you need somebody to make a decision.
I love that point. Juan Pedro, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yes, the first thing that I saw last year when the pandemic started was because at the beginning there was a big lack of collaboration internationally. So after everybody was hit by this wave, everybody started to collaborate. And then once we understood that collaboration was the way to solve the things, everything had a path to go through. And we changed and we are making progress. And so for me, the key here at an international level is the same, is collaboration. We need to talk each other. I think we are all humans, so we can find the things that we agree. We want our countries, the people in our countries to develop, to reach the potential, and etc. So everybody wants the same. So I think what Laura mentioned about data, so sharing data, analyzing, trying to be objective on some things, and trying to agree in the things we all want. We need to focus on that to make progress. But of course, with the I think it's the fourth wave of internet, we can call it, with crypto that is changing everything, with climate change that is a global issue. All these big things are global. So if we don't collaborate, if we don't agree, at least in a set of things, to start to have that as a base stone to build on top of that, we will be in a mess. So like last year, so we saw it, and we also saw it that we can do it, and if we do it, we make progress at the global level very quickly. So it's up to us.
Thank you.
A quick one on this. Coming from Malaysia, I think in 2021, early this year, Malaysia launched a Malaysia Digital Economic Blueprint. Under one of the thrusts, we're looking at strengthened data protection and privacy. Where coming from a developed country, I think this is a very good step where we are heading. We're looking at how can we enhance the Data Protection Act. Everything is there, but maybe not as complicated and not as robust as what the Europe and the American has. But with that national digital blueprint, we are looking at how can we enhance this to build more trust and to give better control of your personal data. How do you do that? But again, this is the logjam that was when Mike asked earlier. Who's at benefit at this? Whether it's the criminal or whether it's government, but it's still up in the air. But we're looking at the data need to be protected. I think that is the future. You cannot be just up in the air. Everyone wants it. Just get an access to that. It has to be better control on that, lah. I think that's my take on that.
Thank you, Tengku. I thought I'd maybe pivot. I'm looking at the clock. We have a few minutes left, but it sort of comes off of a point you just made, Juan Pedro, about the new ways in which we are working and engaging that we've discovered over the past 18 months through the COVID experience. And I want to tie this into more about people. So let's think about the way we've changed the way we work, even this video conference. Prior to COVID-19, I think I did a video conference once in my life. But what we see is that the scaling of telecommuting is really creating new opportunities for more inclusive prosperity, more inclusivity just in general, enabling workers to access jobs, perhaps even outside of their normal geographic regions. For example, people who live in less developed economies, countries, and rural areas, declining industrial areas, and maybe people, I know in particular in the United States, who cannot afford to live in job-rich, high cost of living locations. But we all have, and we all come from different environments, and we have different rules, we have different employment situations. But I'm wondering if I could hear from maybe each of you or some of you, what kind of regulatory reforms do you see that are needed, such as worker protection, worker entitlements, labor standards, even around data flows that would reduce barriers to, I'll call it cross-border remote work, whether it's within a country or amongst the various countries in which we all live and work? Any thoughts, reactions, best practices, thinking there? Margareta, did you want to chime in?
I just when you said this, the one thing that comes to my mind right now is, and this cross-border in Europe, where actually it should be made easier, are the tax regulations. It's very unclear how people are taxed in this case if you work across the border. Even if you work, and just speaking from the example of Switzerland, where many people live in France, they have to come into the office, and it has a health consequence, right? They have to come into the office because otherwise they will be taxed according to the French system, which is much higher taxes. So yes, it uncovered all kinds of very counterintuitive issues that we will need to be fixed, and I don't see other fixing than some type of an international agreement, which is going to probably take very long, or bilateral agreements, right? But this is a global issue.
Can I throw in a bit of a curveball talking? I mean, really picking up on Margareta's point. And we've got a problem now in the UK because of Brexit and all the rest of it. It's very difficult to employ people in Europe, right? Anyway, actually, what you can do to actually subvert all of this, of course, is through Bitcoin. And I think that there is a real, I mean, it's an existential threat actually to the dollar. It's a very, very big issue. As taxation goes up in certain countries and you're looking to actually access work elsewhere, you're going to find a lot of cryptocurrency becoming the norm. And, yeah.
There's maybe, and when you, just one more point, there are also solutions that are platforms that are emerging right now that allow for doing this, private sector platforms, which is also an interesting issue. It does not solve the issue, but it fills the gap and it provides a solution. Maybe that's what it is.
Given the perspective from Latin America, the labor laws here are very controversial. In almost every country in Latin America, the labor laws are very old. In Argentina, for example, it's from 1975. Nobody wants to touch them because of the problem with the people on the streets. There's a very hard issue to tackle, but what is happening is that a lot of people is working for abroad, and they are receiving the payments in crypto, and so and the government cannot do anything, and this is happening, but I don't know how many people is working like that, but it's a huge problem. So it's a lot of pressure, and also these very old laws are preventing people that are outside of the work environment to get in. I think we all saw what happened in Chile 2 years ago. Brazil is something similar. We are all in the same. So there's a lot of pressure for the government to change that. But with internet and with more people learning to develop, to code, this is a bigger issue. So I don't know how they are going to solve it, but pressure is like increasing. All right.
Yeah. Well, you raise an interesting point, and reflecting on Laura's comments, this really existential challenge. And so we have this, it seems like we have this tension. We claim that, regulations don't keep pace with technological change. Then we have, on the other hand, well, technological change is happening, so don't overregulate it too fast. So, it's an interesting space we find ourselves in. And I just, with the last 2 or 3 minutes, and because I know I need to turn it back over to Roberto, I maybe just to come back, bookend, we've talked about several emerging disruptive technologies that are challenging the regulatory spaces in a variety of ways. And in just a lightning round, I'd like to just ask each of you to maybe share which emerging technology or technologies, I'll let you have a choice, are either giving you the greatest heartburn and concern or to Laura's optimism. And in the sense that whether you think the regulatory environment is right or wrong, but you see as really an enhancer to long-term innovation capacity. It could be in your nation, it could be globally. Anyone want to go first with their choice?
May I go first on this?
Yeah, please take them.
The one that gave me goosebumps when Elon Musk started to say that they have sentient AI robot that are going to be replacing the boring, dangerous, and mundane works. Who's going to be regulating this? It's AI. So what if something bad happened to that or something, they start learning, Terminator all over again. So the technology seems to be very advanced, but how we are regulating that is still not up to the pace. But you cannot say that it cannot be developed. You need to wait for regulation. It doesn't work like that. So everyone needs to work and look at how can we regulate those things. Even it's not sentient robot, it's still AI. I've talked about autonomous vehicle. If something happened, who's at fault? Whether the safety officer or the system or the provider of the system. So it's still up in the air. Thanks.
Can I really reiterate on that? I think you're absolutely right. I think there's one really interesting thing, and that is we need to create bridges also for people. So if you're in the oil and gas business, it's not your fault and you're earning quite a lot of money. Are you going to be dumped on the scrap heap? Are we providing the bridges that allow people to embrace these technologies without losing their jobs, without economies failing, without communities collapsing? And that is a policy working with regulation. But there's a lot of politicians that need to consider you can't have industrial revolutions without eggs getting broken. So let's try and, I got to push this, make a new omelette. There you go.
I'll have mine with ham and cheese. Margareta, Juan Pedro, any thoughts?
Well, maybe one that it looks a little bit further into the future. I agree on the AI point, but one that really gives me a headache when we do a lot of foresight work as well, is anything related to biodigital, not anything, but some biodigital convergence.
Yeah.
Brain-computer interfaces for human enhancement is something that's being talked about, and how are we going to regulate this kind of things? And ethical decisions underpinning those questions.
Yes. Juan Pedro?
Well, what is most interesting to me is the change for everybody to have its own generation of energy. I think the future will be 100% renewable, and in every home, in every business, in every industry, there will be their own generation, and that changes a lot of things. All what we are talking about, robots, technology, crypto, bio, everything uses energy. So I think that will be a completely different world. So I'm very excited about that.
Great. Roberto, I'm going to turn it back to you. I hope we have done our job.
You've done an amazing job, Chad. So thank you so much. This was very exciting. Just to finalize here, a few announcements. Want to thank all of you. And I took note on a few things that we talked today. And we also got several comments here. One of the colleagues attending the session asked about what do we do with this content? We have a GFCC assets page where we have all the videos. We create video clips. We create reports for each one of those individual sessions. We have also several situation papers that are there. So we already shared that here on the chat. So, and maybe Vanessa could share it again. So please check it out. Also, we are using this series of sessions to create something that we release every year, our GFCC Global Competitiveness Principles. So we are building the principles based on the inputs that we're getting from all of you who are joining the conversations as speakers, but also the several comments and inputs that we're getting from our GFCC extended community. So thanks for that. This was an amazing conversation. I think that we all understand that this is a systemic issue and there are lots of systemic things that are emerging. A lot about this whole conversation is really at the nexus connecting public and private sector and the need for understanding, for visibility, for clarity, for trust, for transparency. We heard that here today. The overarching question is that things will happen. They are already happening due to advancement of technology, right? We're having the world being digitized. We're having the explosion of data. New behaviors are emerging. They will emerge. And there's a fundamental change. And thank you, Laura, for bringing, I think, that perspective. There's a fundamental change related to how we see regulation from process to risk. And that also creates lots of challenges for public and private sector. One of the things related to that, and we heard some of the cases and examples. Thank you, Tengu, for sharing what you are doing in Malaysia, in this controlled environment that you are running there. But this, let's say, derivate from the whole conversation that we'll probably need regulation on how to create the special frameworks to test, to learn, and to do new things. And finally, something that I think Margareta, you touched upon that, and Chad, you mentioned that throughout the conversation. What could we learn, and what are some of the global learnings that we could in some way systematize, considering our differences across countries, across sectors? And this is something that we also had a comment here about one of our, coming from one of our distinguished fellows in the GFCC, Jerry, about how we could translate that into our GFCC principles. So amazing conversation. Before we go, two quick things. A GFCC tradition, we take a group picture. So please turn on your cameras. We love to have you all here. So turn on your cameras and smile. Thank you so much, Vanessa and Riley, for making this possible. And final announcement, this session, this whole series will be continued. This is leading up to the GFCC Global Innovation Summit on December the 1st and the 2nd. And next week, we will have a special session on universities. We launched an initiative in 2020 to understand how technology can propel universities into the future. What are some of the issues emerging from that? How universities can impact the globe. On the 15th, we'll have a session that will be led by our colleagues at Queen Mary University London. So Vanessa, if you could share here on the link on the chat information about that. So please stay tuned. And in 2 weeks from now, we will be back here to talk local regional development, how we can frame the future with your inputs and comments. So thank you so much for being here. Chad, thank you so much for leading the conversation. This was amazing. Laura, thank you. Juan Pedro, Margareta, it's always a pleasure to have you.